Random House Audio presents The Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton. Read for you by Chris Knopf.
The Andromeda Strain. A man with binoculars. That is how it began, with a man standing by the side of the road, on a crest overlooking a small Arizona town on a winter night. Lieutenant Roger Shawn must have found the binoculars difficult. The metal would be cold, and he would be clumsy in his fur parka and heavy gloves. His breath hissing out in the moonlit air would have fogged the lenses. He would be forced to pause to wipe them frequently, using a stubby gloved finger. He could not have known the futility of this action. Binoculars were worthless to see into that town and uncover its secrets. He would have been astonished to learn that the men who finally succeeded used instruments 1,000,000 times more powerful than binoculars. There is something sad, foolish, and human in the image of Shawn, leaning against a boulder, propping his arms on it, and holding the binoculars to his eyes. Though cumbersome, the binoculars would at least feel comfortable and familiar in his hands. It would be one of the last familiar sensations before his death. We can imagine and try to reconstruct what happened from that point on.
Okay, here we go.
Lieutenant Shawn swept over the town slowly and methodically. He could see it was not large, just half a dozen wooden buildings set out along a single main street. It was very quiet. No lights, no activity. No sound carried by the gentle wind. He shifted his attention from the town to the surrounding hills. They were low, dusty, and blunted, with scrubby vegetation and an occasional withered yucca tree crusted in snow. Beyond the hills were more hills, and then the flat expanse of the Mojave Desert, trackless and vast. The Indians called it the country of lost borders. Lieutenant Shawn found himself shivering in the wind. It was February, the coldest month, and it was after 10. He walked back up the road toward the Ford Econovan with the large rotating antenna on top. The motor was idling softly. It was the only sound he could hear.
Turn left.
He opened the rear doors and climbed into the back, shutting the doors behind him. He was enveloped in a deep red light, a night light, so that he would not be blinded when he stepped outside. In the red light, the banks of instruments and electronic equipment glowed greenly. Private Lewis Crane, the electronics technician, was there, also wearing a parka. He was hunched over a map, making calculations with occasional reference to the instruments before him. Shawn asked Crane if they were certain they had arrived at the place, and Crane confirmed that they had. Both men were tired.
Turn right.
They had driven all day from Vandenberg in search of the latest scoop satellite. Neither knew much about the scoops, except that they were a series of secret capsules intended to analyze the upper atmosphere and then return. Shawn and Crane had the job of finding the capsules once they had landed.
Go straight on.
In order to facilitate recovery, the satellites were fitted with electronic beepers that began to transmit signals when they came down to an altitude of 5 miles. That was why the van had so much radio directional equipment.
Turn left.
Crane tapped the map with a pencil in a nervous way and announced the name of the town at the foot of the hill. Piedmont,
This is
Arizona.
where it ends.
Population 48. Both men laughed over that. There was no denying the radio directional equipment which located the satellite beeper directly in the center of the town. Shawn suggested that someone from the town might have seen it coming down. It would be glowing with the heat and might have retrieved it, bringing it into Piedmont. This was reasonable, except that a native of Piedmont who happened upon an American satellite, fresh from space, would have told someone. Reporters, police, NASA, the Army, someone. But they had heard nothing. And then Shawn noticed the birds. In the light of the full moon, he could see them, big birds, gliding in slow circles over the buildings, passing like black shadows across the face of the moon. He wondered why he hadn't noticed them before, and asked Crane what he made of them.
Turn left. and then
Crane
turn
said
right.
he didn't make anything of them. As a joke, he added, "Maybe they're buzzards." "That's what they look like, all right,"
Go straight on.
Sean said. Crane laughed nervously, his breath hissing out into the night. "But why should there be buzzards here? They only come when something's dead." Sean turned to Crane and said,
Turn
"You better
right.
go down and have a look." Patrol for Project Scoop. Lieutenant Edgar Comroe sat with his feet on his desk and a stack of scientific journal articles before him. Comroe was serving as control officer for the night. It was a duty he filled once a month, directing the evening operations of the skeleton crew of 12. Tonight, the crew was monitoring the progress and reports of the van-coded Caper 1, now making its way across the Arizona desert. The overhead loudspeaker, which carried the voice transmission from the van of Sean and Crane, clicked on. Sean said, "This is Caper 1 to Vandal-Deca. Caper 1 to Vandal-Deca. Are you reading?
Keep
Over."
left.
"We are about to enter the town of Piedmont and recover the satellite." "Very good, Caper 1. Leave your radio open." Over the crackling static, Comroe heard the rumbling of the van engine, and he heard the two men in the van talking quietly. "Did you see that?" "See what?" "Back there on the sidewalk, it looked like a body." Then Comroe heard the van come to a halt, brakes squealing. "Jesus, it's another one, sir." Sean's voice became louder, more formal as he ran through the call. "This is Caper 1 to Vandal-Deca, over." Comroe picked up the microphone. "Reading you. What's happened?" Sean, his voice tight, said, "Sir, we see bodies. Lots of them. They appear to be dead." Comroe said mildly, "Proceed to the capsule, Caper 1. Then he picked up the telephone and said, "Get me Major Manchek, Manchek. This is a stat call. I'll hold." While he waited, he cradled the phone on his shoulder and lit a cigarette. Over the loudspeaker, Sean could be heard to say, "They're all over. There must be dozens of them. Like they dropped in their tracks, stumbled and fallen down dead. All over the streets, on the sidewalks." Another silence, then Crane. "Sir?" "Jesus. You see him? The man in the white robe, walking across the street?" The next sound was a high-pitched scream and a crunching noise. Transmission ended at this point, and Vandenberg Scoop Mission Control was not able to raise the two men again. Major Arthur Manchek, his face still creased with sleep, sat at the edge of Comroe's desk and listened to the replay of the tape from the van. When it was finished, he said, "Strangest damn thing I ever heard," and played it over again. While he did so, he carefully
Go
filled
straight
his pipe
on.
with tobacco, lit it, and tapped it down. Arthur Manchek was an engineer, a quiet, heavy-set man. He had come from Wright-Patterson in Ohio, where he had been in charge of experiments in spacecraft landing methods. His success led to a promotion and transfer to Vandenberg. Here he did administrative work and hated it. People bored Manchek. The mechanics of manipulation and the vagaries of subordinate personality held no fascination for him. He often wished he were back at the wind tunnels of Wright-Patterson. Now he sighed and puffed on his pipe as the tape spun out for the second time. "No communications breakdown, I take it?" Comroe shook his head. "We checked all systems at this end. We're still monitoring the frequency." "We need evidence," Manchek said, almost to himself. He was considering categories of evidence and possible findings, contingencies. "Evidence of what?" Manchek ignored the question. "Have we got a scavenger on the base?" "I'm not sure, sir. If we don't, we can get one from Edwards." "Then do it." Manchek stood up. "We'll want a flyby over that town and a complete scan. All canisters to come directly. Alert the labs." Two lead jets swooped low, dipping gracefully toward the town. They were seemingly inches above the ground as they began to release the phosphorus bombs. As each struck the ground, a blazing white-hot sphere went up, bathing the town
Go straight on.
in an unearthly glaring light and reflecting off the metal underbellies of the planes. The jets climbed, their runs finished, but Samuel Gunnar Wilson, flying the sleek black Scavenger, the operational version of the X-18, did not see them. His entire attention, his mind and his body, was focused on the town. "All yours, Gunnar." Wilson did not answer. He dropped his nose, cracked down his flaps, and felt a shudder as the plane sank, sickeningly like a stone toward the ground. The plane was fitted with two side-slung 16mm cameras, one for the visible spectrum and one for low-frequency radiation. In addition, it had a center-mount Hohmann's infrared multi-spec camera, as well as the usual electronic and radio detection gear. Gunner pressed the camera buttons and felt, rather than heard, the vibrating whir of the cameras. For a long moment he continued to fall, and then he shoved the stick forward and the plane seemed to catch in the air, to grab and lift and climb. He had a fleeting glimpse of the main street. He saw bodies. Bodies everywhere, spread-eagled, lying in the streets, across cars. "Jesus," he said. And then he was up, still climbing, bringing the plane around in a slow arc, preparing for the descent into his second run and trying not to think of what he had seen. One of the first rules of air reconnaissance was ignore the scenery. Analysis and evaluation were not the job of the pilot. That was left to the experts. And pilots who forgot this, who became too interested in what they were photographing, got into trouble. Usually they crashed. As the plane came down into a flat second run, he tried not to look at the ground. But he did, and again saw the bodies. The phosphorus flares were burning low. The lighting was darker, more sinister and subdued. But the bodies were still there. He had not been imagining it. "Jesus," he said again. "Sweet Jesus." The sign on the door said Data Prosex Epsilon, and underneath in red lettering, admission by clearance card only. Inside was a comfortable sort of briefing room, screen on one wall, a dozen steel tubing and leather chairs facing it, and a projector in the back. When Manchek and Comro entered the room, Jaggers, the technician, was already waiting for them, standing at the front of the room by the screen. Jaggers rubbed his hands as Manchek and Comro sat down. "Well then," he said, "might as well get right to it. I think we have something to interest you tonight." He nodded to the projectionist in the back. "First picture." The room lights darkened.
Go straight on.
There was a mechanical click, and the screen lighted to show an aerial view of a small desert town. "This is an unusual shot. From our files, taken 2 months ago from Janos 12R recon satellite, you can see the town here. Not too much to look at, even from 187 miles. Another click. This was dark with a reddish tint and was clearly an overview of the town. The outlines of the buildings were very dark. "We begin here with the scavenger jet's IR
Keep
plates.
right,
These
and
are
then
infrared
exit
films,
right.
as you know, which produce a picture on the basis of heat instead of light. Anything warm appears white on the picture. Anything cold is black." "What are
Exit
those
right.
white spots?" Comro said. "There were 40 or 50 white areas on film." "Those," Jagger said, "are
Turn
bodies.
right.
Some inside houses, some in the street. By count, they number 50. At that moment, a private entered the room with 3 circular metal canisters under his arm. "Sir, we have films of the direct visualization by the pilot." "Run them," Manchek said. The screen showed the town bathed in glaring white light as the plane came down over it. The bodies were clearly visible. Manchek got up and walked close to the screen, peering off to one side. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a figure. It was a man in knee-length white robe standing and looking up at the plane. He was an old man with a withered face. His eyes were wide. Jagger smiled bleakly. "The man looks alive to me, sir." "Yes," Manchek said crisply. "He certainly does." And with that he walked out of the room. As he left, he paused and announced that he was declaring a state of emergency. Arthur Manchek stepped into the small soundproofed booth and sat down before the telephone. He knew exactly what he was going to do, but he was not very sure why he was doing it. Manchek picked up the telephone and dialed. The time was exactly 12 midnight. The machinery was there. The cables, the codes, the teleprinters had all been waiting dormant for 2 years. It only required Manchek's call to set the machinery in motion. When he finished dialing, he heard a series of clicks, and then a low hum, which meant he knew that the call was being fed into one of the scrambled trunk lines. After a moment, the humming stopped, and a voice said, "This is a recording. State your name and your message and hang up." "Major Arthur Manchek, Vandenberg Air Force Base, Scoop Mission Control. I believe it is necessary to call up a wildfire alert. I have confirmatory visual data at this post, which has just been closed for security reasons. There was no answer, only a click as the connection was automatically broken. The line was dead. He hung up and sighed. It was all very unsatisfying. Allison Stone was tired. At her home in the hills overlooking the Stanford campus, she and her husband, the chairman of the Stanford Bacteriology Department, had held a party for 15 couples, and everyone had stayed late. Mrs. Stone was annoyed. She had been raised in official Washington, where 1 second cup of coffee, offered pointedly without cognac, was accepted as a signal to go home. Unfortunately, she thought academics did not follow the rules. She had served the second cup of coffee hours ago, and everybody was still there. Shortly before 1 a.m., the doorbell rang. Answering it, she was surprised to see 2 military men standing side by side in the night. "I'm sorry to disturb you, ma'am," one said politely, "but is this the residence of Dr. Jeremy Stone?" "Yes," she said, frowning slightly, "it is." "Ma'am, we must see Dr. Stone at once, please." It all seemed strange to her, and she found herself frightened. Everyone was still talking and laughing. The room was noisy and dense with smoke. She found Jeremy in a corner, in the midst of some argument about riots. She touched his shoulder, and he disengaged himself from the group. "I know this sounds funny," she said, "but there are some kind of army men here. They say they want to see you." For a moment, Stone looked surprised, and then he nodded. "I'll take care of it." His attitude annoyed her. He seemed almost to be expecting it. "Captain Morton," the man said to Stone. He did not offer to shake hands. "There's a fire, sir." "All right," Stone said. He looked down at his dinner jacket. "Do I have time to change?" "I'm afraid not, sir." To her astonishment, Allison saw her husband nod quietly. "All right." He turned to her and said, "I've got to leave." His face was blank and expressionless, and it seemed to her like a nightmare. His face was like that while he spoke. "What is it?" she said. "Are you under arrest?" "No," he said with a slight smile. "It's nothing like that. Make my apologies to everyone, will you?" In the car, Stone was given a file to read. Stenciled on the brown cardboard cover was Project Summary Scoop. "Nothing else?" Stone said. "No, sir." Stone sighed. He had never heard of Project Scoop before. The file would have to be read carefully. But it was too dark in the car to read. There would be time for that later on the airplane. He found himself thinking back over the last 5 years. Back to the rather odd symposium on Long Island, and the rather odd little speaker from England who had, in his own way, begun it all. In the summer of 1962, J.J. Merrick, the English biophysicist, presented a paper to the 10th Biological Symposium at Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island. The paper was entitled Frequencies of Biologic Contact According to Speciation Probabilities, and its subject was the form that Earth's first contact with extraterrestrial life might take. Merrick had concluded, all available evidence on the origin of life points to the evolutionary progression from simple to complex life forms. This is true on Earth. It is probably true throughout the universe. My own calculations, indicated earlier in the paper, consider the relative abundance of different organisms throughout the universe. Unicellular organisms, Merrick said, were by far the most numerous on Earth. These considerations lead me to believe that the first human interaction with extraterrestrial life will consist of contact with organisms similar to, if not identical to, Earth bacteria or viruses. The consequences of such contact are disturbing when one recalls that 3% of all Earth bacteria are capable of exerting some deleterious effect upon man. Later, Merrick himself considered the possibility that the first contact would consist of a plague brought back from the moon by the first men to go there. This idea was received with amusement by the assembled scientists.
Keep left.
One of the first who took it seriously was Jeremy Stone. At the age of 36, Stone was perhaps the most famous person attending the symposium that year. He was professor of bacteriology at Berkeley, a post he had held since he was 30, and he had just won the 1961 Nobel Prize. The award was given for work on bacterial mutant reversion that he had done in his spare time as a law student at Michigan when he was 26. Already, he was being compared to Einstein and to Bohr as a scientist with a conscience, an overview, an appreciation of the significance of events. Physically, Stone was a thin, balding man with a prodigious memory that cataloged scientific facts and blew jokes with equal facility. But his most outstanding characteristic was a sense of impatience, the feeling he conveyed to everyone around him that they were just wasting his time. Yet it was Stone who, in the early 1960s, moved forward in government circles as one of the spokesmen for the new scientific establishment. Stone had been intrigued by Marek's ideas, which paralleled certain concepts of his own. He explained these in a short paper entitled Sterilization
Go
of
straight on.
Spacecraft, printed in Science and later reprinted in the British journal Nature. The argument stated that bacterial contamination was a two-edged sword and that man must protect against both edges. Previous to Stone's paper, most discussion of contamination dealt with the hazards to other planets, of satellites, and probes inadvertently carrying Earth organisms. Stone considered the reverse situation. He stated that it was equally possible for extraterrestrial organisms to contaminate the Earth via space probes. He noted the spacecraft that burned up in re-entry presented no problem, but live returns, manned flights, and probes such as the Scoop satellites were another matter entirely. Here he said, the question of contamination was very great. In 1963, he began an informal seminar group that met twice monthly on the top floor of the University of California Medical School Biochemistry Wing for lunch and discussion of the contamination problem. It was this group that eventually formed the early nucleus of the Wildfire Project. They presented a petition to the President in 1964 in a letter consciously patterned after the Einstein letter to Roosevelt in 1940 concerning the atomic bomb. The letter stated, "It is our belief that sterilization for re-entry probes and manned capsules can never be wholly satisfactory. We therefore urge the establishment of a facility designed to deal with an extraterrestrial life form should one inadvertently be introduced to the Earth. The purpose of this facility would be twofold: to limit dissemination of the life form and to provide laboratories for its investigation and analysis, with a view to protecting Earth life forms from its influence." Response to the letter was gratifyingly prompt. 24 hours later, Stone received a call from one of the President's advisors, and the following day, he flew to Washington to confer with the President and members of the National Security Council. 2 weeks after that, he flew to Houston to discuss further plans with NASA officials. The Defense Department responded with an outright appropriation of $22 million for the construction of a special, isolated laboratory. Once money was funded, construction proceeded rapidly. The eventual result, the Wildfire Laboratory, was built in 1966 in Flat Rock, Nevada. Design was awarded to the naval architects of the Electric Boat Division of General Dynamics, since GD had considerable experience designing living quarters on atomic submarines where men had to live and work for prolonged periods. The plan consisted of a conical underground structure with 5 floors. Each floor was circular, with a central service of wiring, plumbing, and elevators. Each floor was more sterile than the one above. The first floor was non-sterile, the second moderately sterile, the third stringently sterile, and so on. Passage from one floor to another was not free. Personnel had to undergo decontamination and quarantine procedures in passing either up or down. Once the laboratory was finished, it only remained to select the Wildfire Alert Team, the group of scientists who would study any new organism. After a number of studies of team composition, 4
Get
men
ready
were
to
selected,
turn right.
including Jeremy Stone himself. These were prepared to mobilize immediately in the event of a biologic emergency.
Turn right.
Stone could not have known the reasons behind Washington's eagerness, for Stone knew nothing until the night he had left the party and drove off in the military sedan of Project Scoop. Once he was on the plane, a Boeing 727 that was completely empty, he settled down to read the file. Scoop was the brainchild of Major General Thomas Sparks, head of the Army Medical Corps, Chemical and Biological Warfare Division. Stone learned that Project Scoop was contracted to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory of the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena in 1963. In theory, JPL was designing a satellite to enter the fringes of space and collect organisms and dust for study. This was considered a project of pure science, almost curiosity, and was thus accepted by all the scientists working on the study. In fact, the true aims were quite different. The true aims of Scoop were to find new life forms, new biological weapons of war. Few Americans, Stone knew, were aware of the magnitude of U.S. research into chemical and biological warfare, or CBW. The total government expenditure in CBW exceeded $500 million a year. With so much money and effort going into CBW, one might think that new and more virulent weapons would be continuously perfected. However, this was not the case from 1961 to 1965. The conclusion of the Senate Preparedness Subcommittee in 1961 was that conventional research has been less than satisfactory, and that new avenues and approaches of inquiry should be opened within the field. That was precisely what Major General Thomas Sparks intended to do with Project Scoop. In final form, Scoop was a program to orbit 17 satellites around the Earth, collecting organisms and bringing them back to the surface. Up until the time Stone sat reading the project file, 6 Scoop satellites had gone up and none had brought back anything of interest. Scoop 7 was launched soon after Scoop 6. The exact date is classified, but it is believed to be February 5, 1967. Scoop 7 immediately went into stable orbit with an apogee of 317 miles and a perigee of 224 miles. It remained in orbit for 2.5 days. At that time, the satellite abruptly left stable orbit for unknown reasons, and it was decided to bring it down by radio command. The anticipated landing site was a desolate area in northeastern Arizona. Mark said later, a horrifying experience. In an instant, I was taken from the most familiar of worlds and plunged into the most unfamiliar. Like most surgeons, Hall was insistent upon routine. Everything had to be done in a certain order, in a certain way. If not, he became upset. Because the others in the operating room knew this, they looked up toward the overhead viewing gallery with apprehension when Levitt appeared. Levitt clicked on the intercom that connected the upstairs room to the operating room below and said, "Hello, Mark." Hall had been draping the patient, placing green sterile cloths over every part of the body except for the abdomen. He looked up with surprise. "Hello, Peter," he said. "Sorry to disturb you," Levitt said, "but this is an emergency." "Have to wait," Hall said. "I'm starting a procedure." "Kelly will take over for you," Levitt said. "It's all arranged. I'll expect to meet you in the surgeon's change room in about 30 seconds. Hall glared at everyone in the room. No one moved or spoke. After a moment, he stripped off his gloves and stomped out of the room, swearing once very loudly. Hall viewed his own association with wildfire as tenuous at best. In 1966, he had been approached by Levitt, the chief of bacteriology of the hospital, who explained in a sketchy way the purpose of the project. Hall found it all rather amusing and had agreed to join the team if his services ever became necessary. Privately, he was confident that nothing would ever come of wildfire. For his own part, Peter Levitt was irritated with Hall. In general, Levitt had little patience with practicing physicians. Though he had an MD degree, Levitt had never practiced, preferring to devote his time to research. His field was clinical microbiology and epidemiology, and his specialty was parasitology. Within the hospital, he was known as a superb clinical bacteriologist, but his real interest was parasites. Levitt's reputation had made him a natural choice for wildfire, and it was through Levitt that Hall had been asked to join. Levitt knew the reasons behind Hall's selection, though Hall did not. When Levitt had asked him to join, Hall had demanded to know why. "I'm just a surgeon," he said. "Yes," Levitt said, "but you know electrolytes." "So?" "That may be important. Blood chemistries, pH, acidity, alkalinity, the whole thing may be vital when the time comes." "But there are a lot of electrolyte people," Hall had pointed out, "and many of them better than me." "Yes," Levitt had said, "but they're all married." "So what?" "We need a single man." "Why?" "It's necessary that one member of the team be unmarried." "That's crazy," Hall had said. "Maybe," Levitt had said. "Maybe not." At 9:59 a.m. on the same morning, a K-4 jet helicopter lifted off the concrete of Vandenberg's maximum security hangar, MSH-9, and headed east toward Arizona. Inside the helicopter were 3 men, a pilot and 2 scientists, and all 3 wore clear plastic inflatable suits, making them look like obese men from Mars. The 2 passengers in the belly looked at each other. One was Jeremy Stone, the other Charles Burton. Both men had arrived at Vandenberg just a few hours before. Stone from Stanford and Burton from Baylor University in Houston. Burton was 54, a pathologist. He held a professorship at Baylor Medical School and served as a consultant to the NASA Manned Spaceflight Center in Houston. Earlier, he had done research at the National Institute in Bethesda. His field had been the effects of bacteria on human tissues. As a result of his work with Staphylococcus aureus, a common skin pathogen responsible for pimples and boils, new strains of which were later found to cause bizarre deaths, his grant appropriation jumped to $300,000 a year. Looking back, Burton felt no great pride in his accomplishment. It was, he knew, a matter of luck, of being in the right place and doing the right work when the time came. Sitting across from him, Jeremy Stone tried to conceal his distaste for Burton's appearance. Beneath the plastic suit, Burton wore a dirty plaid sport shirt with a stain on the left breast pocket. His trousers were creased and frayed, and even his hair, Stone felt, was unruly and untidy. 50 people, Stone said, shaking his head. Dead within 8 hours of the landing of Scoop 7.
Get ready to turn left.
The question is one of spread. Presumably airborne, Burton said. Yes, presumably.
Turn left.
Even if you slit a man's throat with a razor, Burton said, you won't get death that rapidly. Cutting both cartoids and jugulars still allows 10 to 40 seconds before unconsciousness and nearly a minute before death. At Piedmont, it seems to have occurred in a second or 2. Over the intercom, the helicopter pilot said, Piedmont approaching, gentlemen. Please advise. Stone said, circle once and give us a look at it. The helicopter banked steeply. The 2 men looked out and saw the town below them. The buzzards had landed during the night and were thickly clustered around the bodies. I was afraid of that, Stone said. They may represent a vector for infection spread, Burton said. Eat the meat of infected people and carry the organisms away with them. Stone nodded, staring out the window. What do we do? Gas them, Stone said. The helicopter tilted and swung back. Soon the 2 men could not see the ground for the clouds of pale blue gas. What is it? Chlorazine, Stone said. Highly effective in low concentrations on aviary metabolism. The gas slowly cleared in the gentle wind moving off to the south. Soon they could see the ground again. Hundreds of birds lay there. A few flapped their wings spastically, but most were already dead. Stone frowned as he watched. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew he had forgotten something, or ignored something, some fact, some vital clue that the birds provided and he must not overlook. These lay everywhere, heaped and flung across the ground in attitudes of frozen surprise. But there was no sound. No reassuring rumble of an automobile engine, no barking dog, no shouting children. For a long time the men said nothing, but stood in the street, looking about them, feeling the wind tug at their oversized suits. Finally, Stone said, why are they all outside in the street? If this was a disease that arrived at night, most of the people would be indoors. Not only that, Burton said, they're mostly wearing pajamas. It was a cold night last night. You'd think they had to stop to put on a jacket or a raincoat, something to keep warm. Maybe they were in a hurry.
Get
do
ready
what?
to turn right.
Burton said. To see something, Stone said with a helpless shrug. Burton bent over the first body they came to. Odd,
Turn
he
right.
said. Look at the way this fellow is clutching his chest. Quite a few of them are doing that. Looking at the body, Stone saw that the hands of many were pressed to their chests, some flat, some clawing. They didn't seem to be in pain. Their faces are quite peaceful. Almost astonished, in fact. These people look cut down, caught in mid-stride. Coronary, Stone said. Doubt it. They should grimace. It's painful. But somehow I think these people died a painless death, which means they are clutching their chest because they couldn't breathe, Stone said. Burton was beginning to regain his composure now after the initial shock of the town. He was beginning to think clearly. They walked up to the van, standing in the middle of the street, its lights still shining weakly. Stone reached in to turn off the lights. He pushed the stiff body of the driver back from the wheel and read the name on the breast pocket of the parka. Sean. Let's go find the satellite, Stone said. That's our first job. We can worry later about... He stopped. He was looking at the face of Sean, who had obviously pitched forward hard onto the steering wheel at the moment of death. There was a large arc-shaped cut across his face, shattering the bridge of his nose and tearing the skin. I don't get it. Get what? This injury, look at it. Very clean. Remarkably clean, in fact. Practically no bleeding. Then Burton realized. Broken capillaries, shattered bone, torn scalp veins. It should bleed like hell. Yes, Stone said. It should. And look at the other bodies. Even where the vultures have chewed at the flesh. No bleeding. It was 15 minutes before they were able to locate the satellite on the outskirts of the town. They pulled up before a plain, single-story wood-frame house. A sign creaked in the wind.
Keep right,
Dr.
and
Allen
then
Benedict.
continue straight on.
Might have known, Stone said. They'd take it to the doctor. The two men
Go
climbed
straight
out of the
on.
van and went up to the house. The front door was open, hanging in the breeze. They entered the living room and found it empty. Turning right, they came to the doctor's office. Benedict was there, a pudgy, white-haired man. He was seated before his desk, with several textbooks laid open. Along one wall were bottles, syringes, pictures of his family, and several others showing men in combat uniforms. And then they saw the satellite. It was upright, a sleek, polished cone 3 feet high, and its edges had been cracked and seared from the heat of re-entry. It had been opened crudely, apparently with the help of a pair of pliers and chisel that lay on the floor next to the capsule. The bastard opened it, Stone said. Stupid son of a bitch. How was he to know? He might have asked somebody, Stone said. He bent over the satellite and closed the gaping triangular hatch. Burton leaned over the body. Come on, he said to Stone. Help me. Do what? Strip him down. Why? I want to check the lividity. There was no dependent lividity. Normally, after a person died, blood seeped to the lowest points, drawn down by gravity. A person who died in bed had a purple back from accumulated blood. But Benedict, who had died sitting up, had no blood in the tissue of his buttocks or thighs, or in his elbows, which had rested on the arms of the chair. Holding the scalpel carefully, Burton drew the blade along the skin of the inner wrist, just behind the thumb. The skin pulled back from the wound, which was completely bloodless. He exposed fat and subcutaneous tissue. There was no bleeding. Amazing. He cut deeper. There was still no bleeding from the incision. Suddenly, abruptly, he struck a vessel. Crumbling red-black material fell out onto the floor. I'll be damned, Stone said. Clotted solid, Burton said. Incredible. They began to search the other houses in town.
Keep
One
right.
contained a man, his wife, and their young daughter, all sitting around the dinner table. They had apparently been relaxed and happy, and none of them had time to push back their chairs from the table. They remained frozen in attitudes of congeniality, smiling at each other across the plates of now rotting food and flies.
Keep right, and then turn
Roy
right.
O. Thompson lived alone. From his greasy coveralls, they assumed he ran the town gas station. Roy had apparently filled his
Turn
bathtub
right.
with water, then knelt down, stuck his head in, and held it there until he died. When they found him, his body was rigid, holding himself under the surface of the water. There was no one else around and no sign of struggle. Impossible, Stone said. No one can commit suicide that way. Of 60 sat stiffly in a chair in the living room wearing his World War I uniform. He had been a captain in that war, and he had become a captain again, briefly, before he shot himself through the right temple with a Colt 45. There was no blood in the room when they found him. He appeared almost ludicrous, sitting there with a clean, dry hole in his head. Crazy, he said. Stark, raving, mad. Stone nodded. Some of them died instantly, and others went quietly nuts. It was then they heard the sound of crying. Not far, 2 houses up the right side. A man and a woman lay outside on the sidewalk, fallen and clutching their chests. They ran past them and into the house. The crying was still louder, filled the empty rooms. They hurried upstairs, clambering up, and came to the bedroom. A large double bed unmade, a dresser, a mirror, a closet, and a small crib. They leaned over, pulling back the blankets from a small, very red-faced, very unhappy infant boy. The baby immediately stopped crying long enough to survey their faces, enclosed in the plastic suits. Then it began to howl again. "Too bad," Burton said. "He can't tell us what happened." "I'm hoping he can," Stone said. Back in the center of the main street, they signaled for the hovering helicopter to descend with the ladder. Burton held the infant, and Stone held the Scoop satellite, strange trophies, Stone thought, from a very strange town. Suddenly, Stone realized that he was not alone on the street. He turned and saw a man behind him. He was an old man, with thin gray hair and a wrinkled, worn face. He wore a long nightgown that was smudged with dirt and yellowed with dust, and his feet were bare.
Keep
He
left.
stumbled and tottered toward Stone. "Who are you?" Stone said. But he knew. The man in the pictures. The one who had been photographed by the airplane.
Hurt me. Not like the others.
He was shaking with fear as he stared at Stone in his plastic suit.
Don't hurt me.
Keep left.
"We won't hurt you," Stone said. "What is your name?"
Jackson. Peter Jackson, sir. Please don't hurt me. You know I'm a sick man.
He faltered, and then doubled over, clutching his stomach. And then he vomited. It came up heavy, deep red, rich with blood. "Mr. Jackson!" But the man was not awake. His eyes were closed, and he was lying on his back. For a moment, Stone thought he was dead. But then he saw the
Said
chest
Charles
moving
there,
slowly.
Chugger.
They used the power winch to hoist up the unconscious body of Peter Jackson, and then lowered it again to raise the capsule. Then slowly, Burton and Stone climbed the ladder into the belly of the helicopter. The pilot established a radio connection to Vandenberg so that Stone could talk with Major Manchek. "What have you found?" Manchek said. "The town is dead. We have good evidence for an unusual process at work." "Be careful," Manchek said. "This is an open circuit." "I am aware of that. Will you order up a 712? "All right," Manchek said. "I'll put through the order." Directive 712 was part of the final wildfire protocol for action in the event of a biologic emergency. It called for the placement of a limited thermonuclear weapon at the site of exposure of terrestrial life to exogenous organisms. The code for the directive was cautery, since the function of the bomb was to cauterize the infection, to burn it out, and thus prevent its spread. As a single step in the wildfire protocol, cautery had been agreed upon by the authorities involved, executive, state, defense, and AEC, after much debate. The AEC, already unhappy about the assignment of a nuclear device to the wildfire laboratory, did not wish cautery to be accepted as a program. State and defense argued that any above-ground
Keep left.
thermonuclear detonation, for whatever purpose, would have serious repercussions internationally. The President finally agreed to Directive 712, but insisted that he retain control over the decision to use a bomb for cautery. Washington came to a decision within an hour of Manchek's report. The reasoning behind the President's decision has never been clear, but the final result was plain enough. The President elected to postpone calling Directive 712 for 24 to 48 hours. Instead, he called out the National Guard and cordoned off the area around Piedmont for a radius of 100 miles, and he waited. Paul, MD, sat in the tight rear seat of the F-104 fighter and stared over the top of the rubber oxygen mask at the file on his knees. Levitt had given it to him just before takeoff, a heavy, thick wad of paper bound in gray cardboard. On the cover of the file was stenciled wildfire, and underneath, an ominous note. "This file is classified top secret. Examination by unauthorized persons is a criminal offense punishable by fines and imprisonment up to 20 years and $20,000. When Levitt gave him the file, Paul had read the note and whistled. "Don't you believe it?" Levitt said. "No, just a scare." "Scare? Hell," Levitt said. "If the wrong man reads this file, he just disappears." Nice. "Read it," Levitt said, "and you'll see why." Paul had skimmed through most of the file. Reading it, he had found, was impossible. Much of its bulk of 274 pages consisted of cross-references and inter-service notations, none of which he could understand. One heading, the odd man hypothesis, had intrigued him, but when he turned to the designated pages, he found they had been removed. Paul was frowning at the page, wondering what it meant, when the pilot said, "Dr. Hall?" "Yeah." "We have just passed the last checkpoint, sir. We will touch down in 4 minutes." "All right." Hall paused. "Do you know where exactly we are landing?" "I believe that it is Flat Rock, Nevada." A few minutes later, the flaps went down and he heard a whine as the airplane slowed. The car turned off the potted road onto a dirt track. It raised a heavy cloud of dust, and despite the heat, Mark Hall and Peter Levitt were forced to roll up the windows. They proceeded another mile, bouncing along the dirt rut, and then came over a hill. Suddenly, Hall saw a large, fenced circle, perhaps 100 yards in diameter. The fence, he noticed, was 10 feet high and sturdy. At intervals, it was laced with barbed wire. Inside was a utilitarian wooden building and a field of corn. "Corn," Hall said. "Rather clever, I think." The sign by the gate said, "Government Property, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Desert Reclamation Test Station." They entered the building, coming directly into a small room. A man in a Stetson hat, checked sport shirt, and a string tie sat at a rickety desk. He was reading a newspaper and eating his lunch. He looked up and smiled pleasantly. "Howdy," he said. "Hello," Levitt said. They walked past him out of the anteroom and down a corridor. The doors had hand-printed labels: seeding incubation, moisture control, soil analysis. A half-dozen people were at work in the building, all of them dressed casually, but all of them apparently busy. "This is a real agricultural station," Levitt said. "If necessary,
Get ready to
that
turn
man
right.
at the desk could give you a guided tour, explaining the purpose of the station and the experiments that are going on.
Turn right.
Mostly, they are attempting to develop a strain of corn that can grow in a low-moisture, high-alkalinity soil." "And the wildfire installation?" "Here," Levitt said. He opened a door marked Storage, and they found themselves staring at a narrow cubicle lined with rakes and hoes and watering hoses. "Step in," Levitt said. Hall did. Levitt followed and closed the door behind him. Hall felt the floor sink, and they began to descend, rakes and hoses and all. In a moment, he found himself in a modern, bare room lighted by banks of cold overhead fluorescent lights. The walls were painted red. The only object in the room was a rectangular, waist-high box that reminded Hall of a podium. It had a glowing green glass top. "Step up to the analyzer," Levitt said. "Place your hands flat on the glass, palms down." Hall felt a faint tingling in his fingers, and then the machine gave a buzz. "All right, step back." Levitt placed his hands on the box, waited for the buzz, and then nodded to a door across the room. What was that thing? "Finger and palm print analyzer. It's fully automatic. Reads a composite of 10,000 dermatographic lines so it can't make a mistake. In its storage banks, it has a record of the prints of everyone cleared to enter wildfire." Levitt pushed through the door. They were in a small room with lockers. Hall found one with his name on it. "We change in here," Levitt said. He nodded to a stack of pink uniforms in one corner. "Put those on after you've removed everything you're wearing." Hall changed quickly. The uniforms were loose-fitting one-piece suits that zipped up the side. When they had changed, they proceeded down a passageway. They passed a sign that said, "You are now entering Level 1. Proceed directly to immunization control." Walls were red. He mentioned this to Levitt. "Yes, all levels are painted a different color. Level 1 is red, 2 yellow, 3 white, 4 green, and 5 blue. They came to immunization. A door slid back, revealing 3 glass booths. Levitt said, "Just sit down in one of them. I suppose this is automatic, too." Hall entered a booth and closed the door behind him. There was a couch and a mass of complex equipment. A flat mechanical voice asked him to recite "Mary Had a Little Lamb" for a voice print. Then it asked him an extensive list of questions about his medical history. Finally, the voice said, "This ends the formal questions. Please undress and lie on the couch." He lay on the couch. "Observe the screen before you. Place your body on the couch so that all points are obliterated." He looked at the screen. He now saw that the points on it were arranged in the shape of a man. A moment later, an ultraviolet lamp swung out on a long arm and moved close to his body. Next to the lamp was some kind of scanning eye. Watching the screen, he could see the computer print of the scan beginning with his feet. "This is a scan for fungus." After several minutes, Hall was ordered to lie on his stomach, and the process was repeated. He was then told to lie on his back once more. A variety of leads snaked out at him and were attached by mechanical hands to his body. Some he could understand. A half-dozen leads over his chest for an electrocardiogram, and 21 on his head for an electroencephalogram. But others were fixed on his stomach, his arms, and his legs. "Place your hand on the board to the left. Do not move. You will feel a slight prick as the intravenous needle is inserted." Hall looked over at the screen. It flashed a color image of his hand with the veins showing in a pattern of green against a blue background. Obviously, the machine worked by sensing heat. He was about to protest when he felt a brief sting. "This completes your physical parameters." Hall
Get
walked with
ready to
Levitt down a
turn left.
long red corridor. He noticed that the walls were slightly curved. Where exactly are we? "On the perimeter of level 1. To our
Turn
left
left.
are all the laboratories. To the right is nothing but solid rock." Several people were walking in the corridor. Everyone wore pink jumpsuits. They all seemed serious and busy. "Where are the others on the team?" Hall said. "Right here," Levitt said. He opened a door marked Conference 7, and they entered a room with a large hardwood table. Stone was there, standing stiffly erect and alert, as if he had just taken a cold shower. Alongside him, Burton, the pathologist, somehow appeared sloppy, confused, and there was a kind of tired fright in his eyes. They all exchanged greetings and sat down. Stone reached into his pocket and removed 2 keys. One was silver, the other red. The red one had a chain attached to it. He gave it to Hall. "Put it around your neck." Hall looked at it. "What's this?" Levitt said, "I'm afraid Mark is still unclear about the odd man." "The fact of the matter is," Stone said, "you are the odd man. You are the key to all this, quite literally." He walked to a corner of the room. He pushed a hidden button and the wood paneling slid away to reveal a burnished metal console. He inserted his key into a lock and twisted it. A green light on the console flashed on. He stepped back. The paneling slid into place. "At the lowest level of this laboratory is an automatic atomic self-destruct device," Stone said.
Get ready to
"It's
turn
controlled
right.
from within the laboratory. I have just inserted my key and armed the mechanism. The device is ready for detonation. The key on this
Turn
level
right.
cannot be removed. It is now locked in place. Your key, on the other hand, can be inserted and removed again. There's a 3-minute delay between the time detonation locks in and the time the bomb goes off. That period is to provide you time to think and perhaps call it all off." Hall was still frowning. "Well, why me?" "Because you are single. We have to have one unmarried man." Stone opened a briefcase and withdrew a file. He gave it to Hall. "Read that." It was Wildfire File. Page 255, Stone said. The page concerned studies showing that unmarried men were able to make decisions twice as effectively as unmarried females, and approximately 2.5 times more effectively than either married women or married men. The study concluded, results of special testing confirm the odd man hypothesis, that an unmarried male should carry out command decisions involving thermonuclear or chembile destruct contexts. When Hall had finished reading, he said, "That's crazy." Nonetheless, Stone said, it was the only way we could get the government to put control of the weapon in our hands. You really expect me to put in my key and fire that thing? I'm afraid you don't understand, Stone said. The detonation mechanism is automatic. Should breakthrough of the organism occur, with contamination of all level 5, detonation will take place within 3 minutes unless you lock in your key and call it off. Oh, Hall said in a quiet voice. A bell rang somewhere on the level. Stone glanced up at the wall clock. It was late. He began the formal briefing, talking rapidly, pacing up and down the room, hands moving constantly. As you know, he said, we are on the top level of a 5-story underground structure. According to protocol, it will take us nearly 24 hours to descend through the sterilization and decontamination procedures to the lowest level. Therefore, we must begin immediately. The capsule is already on its way. He pressed a button on a console at the head of the table, and a television screen glowed to life, showing the cone-shaped satellite in a plastic bag, making its descent. It was being cradled by mechanical hands. He went on to explain that he had brought back 2 other surprises from Piedmont. The screen shifted to show Peter Jackson lying on a litter with intravenous lines running into both arms. Stone flicked a button and the screen showed the baby. It was howling, strapped down to a tiny bed. An intravenous bottle was running into a vein in the scalp. They began at a door which said in plain white letters, "To Level 2." The 4 men passed through the door, which clanged shut heavily and sealed with a hissing sound. It was airtight. Hall faced a tiled room, empty except for a hamper marked clothing. He unzipped his jumpsuit and dropped it into the hamper. There was a brief flash of light as it was incinerated. Then, looking back, he saw that on the door through which he had come was a sign, "Return to Level 1 is not possible through this access." The other men were already moving through the second door marked simply Exit. He followed them and stepped into clouds of steam. The odor was peculiar, a faint woodsy smell that he guessed was scented disinfectant. Dripping wet from the shower, Hall looked around for a towel but found none. He entered the next room, and blowers turned on from the ceiling in a rush of hot air. From the sides of the room, UV lights clicked on, bathing the room in an intense purple light. He stood there until a buzzer sounded and the dryers turned off. His skin tingled slightly as he entered the last room, which contained clothing. Not jumpsuits, but rather like surgical uniforms, light yellow, a loose-fitting top with a V-neck and short sleeves, elastic banded pants, low rubber-soled shoes, quite comfortable like ballet slippers. A nurse by the elevator said, "The time is 2:47 p.m., gentlemen. You may continue your descent in 1 hour." Total immersion, he soon discovered, was guaranteed by the simple device of making the connection between the first room and the second an underwater passage. Swimming through, he felt a slight burning of his eyes, but nothing bad. The second room contained a row of 6 boxes, glass-walled, looking rather like telephone booths. Hall approached one and saw a sign that said, "Enter and close both eyes. Hold arms slightly away from body and stand with feet 1 foot apart. Do not open eyes until buzzer sounds. Blindness may result from exposure to long-wave radiation." They dressed and took the elevator down to level 3. There were 4 nurses waiting for them. One took Hall to an examining room. It turned out to be a 2-hour physical examination, given not by a machine, but by a blank-faced, thorough young man. After 2 hours, he rejoined the others and proceeded to level 4. 4 total immersion baths, 3 sequences of ultraviolet and infrared light, 2 of ultrasonic vibrations, and then something quite astonishing at the end. A steel-walled cubicle with a helmet on a peg. The sign said, "This is an ultra-flash apparatus to protect head and facial hair. Place metal helmet securely on head, then press button below." There was a single brief, dazzling burst of white light, followed by a wave of heat that filled the cubicle. He felt a moment of pain, so swift he hardly recognized it until it was over. Cautiously, he removed the helmet and looked at his body. His skin was covered with a fine, white ash. And then he realized that the ash was his skin, or had been. The machine had burned away the outer epithelial layers. He proceeded to a shower and washed the ash off. When he finally reached the dressing room, he found green uniforms. Another physical. This time they wanted samples of everything: sputum, oral epithelium, blood, urine, stool. Finally, he was brought back to Stone and the others. Stone said, "We have 6 hours on this level. That's protocol, waiting while they do the lab test on us, so we might as well sleep. Down the corridor are rooms marked with your names. Further down is the cafeteria. We'll meet there in 5 hours for a conference."
Go straight on.
Delta Sector was the designation of 3 rooms on Level 1 that contained all communications facilities for the wildfire installation. All intercom and visual circuits between levels were routed through there, as were cables for telephone, teletype from the outside. The trunk lines to the library and the central storage unit were also regulated by Delta Sector. In essence, it functioned as a giant switchboard, fully computerized. The 3 rooms of Delta Sector were quiet. All that could be heard was the soft hum of spinning tape drums and the muted clicking of relays. Only one person worked here, a single man sitting at a console, surrounded by the blinking lights of the computer. There was no real reason for the man to be there. He performed no necessary function. The computers were self-regulating, constructed to run check patterns through their circuits every 12 minutes. The computer shut down automatically if there was an abnormal reading. According to protocol, the man was required to monitor communications, which were signaled by the ringing of a bell on the teleprinter. When the bell rang, he notified the 5 level command centers that the transmission was received. He also required to report any computer dysfunction to Level 1 Command should that unlikely event occur. "Time to wake up, sir." Mark Hall opened his eyes. The room
Go
was lit
straight
with
on.
a steady, pale, fluorescent light. He blinked and rolled over on his stomach. "Time to wake up, sir." It was a beautiful female voice, soft and seductive. He sat up in bed and looked around the room. He was alone. He reached over and pushed a button on the nightstand by his bed. The light went off. He waited for the voice again, but it did not speak. It was, he thought, a hell of an effective way to wake a man up. He pushed the nightstand button again. The voice said softly, "Do you wish for something, sir?" "I'd like to know your name, please." "Will that be all, sir?" "Yeah, I believe so." "Will that be all, sir?" He waited. The light clicked off. He slipped into his shoes and was about to leave when a male voice said, "This is the answering service supervisor, Dr. Hall. I wish you would treat the project more seriously." Hall laughed. So the voice responded to comments and taped his replies. It was a clever system. "The voice," said the supervisor heavily, "belongs to Miss Gladys Stevens, who is 63 years old. She lives in Omaha and makes her living taping messages for SAC crews and other voice reminder systems." "Aha," Hall said. The cafeteria was almost deserted. Levitt was there. He said the others were in the conference room. He pushed a glass of dark brown liquid over to Hall and suggested he have breakfast.
Safely travel, sugar.
42.5 nutrient. It has everything needed to sustain the average 70-kilogram man for 18 hours. Hall drank the liquid, which was syrupy and artificially flavored to taste like orange juice. "Okay, let's go to the conference room. Stone wants to talk about carp." "Who?" "Rudolf Karp." Rudolf Karp was a Hungarian-born biochemist who came to the United States from England in 1951. He began to investigate meteorites with the intent of determining whether they harbored life or showed evidence of having done so in the past. Karp, upon breaking open his meteorites, was able to isolate bacteria. He found that they were ring-shaped organisms, rather like a tiny undulating inner tube, and he found they could grow and multiply. He claimed that while they were essentially similar to earthly bacteria in structure, being based upon proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, they had no cell nucleus, and therefore their manner of propagation was a mystery. Karp presented his information in his usual quiet, unsensational manner and hoped for a good reception. He did not receive one. Instead, he was laughed down by the 7th Conference of Astrophysics and Geophysics, meeting in London in 1961. Levitt, however, had gone over the reports and the papers and found no reason to reject the meteorite studies out of hand. Many of the experiments were careful, well-reasoned, and compelling. He remembered this when he and other wildfire planners drew up the study known as the Vector 3. The Vector 3 was a report that considered a crucial question. If a bacterium invaded the Earth, causing a new disease, where would that bacterium come from? After consultation with astronomers and evolutionary theories, the wildfire group concluded that bacteria could come from 3 sources. The first was the most obvious, an organism from another planet or galaxy which had the protection to survive the extremes of temperature and vacuum that existed in space. There was no doubt that organisms could survive. There was, for instance, a class of bacteria known as thermophilic that thrived on extreme heat, multiplying enthusiastically in temperatures as high as 70 degrees centigrade. Further, it was known that bacteria had been recovered from Egyptian tombs, where they had been sealed for thousands of years. These bacteria were still viable. There was no doubt that a spore could travel through space. But was another planet or galaxy the most likely source of contamination for the Earth? The answer was no. Another source was the closest source, the Earth itself. The report suggested that bacteria could have left the surface of the Earth eons ago, when life was just beginning to emerge from the oceans and the hot-baked continents. Such bacteria would depart before the fishes, before the primitive mammals, long before the first ape man. The bacteria would head up into the air and slowly ascend until they were literally in space. Once there, they might evolve into unusual forms, perhaps even learning to derive energy for life directly from the sun, instead of requiring food as an energy source. These organisms might also be capable of direct conversion of energy to matter. The third source of contamination, the third of the vectors, was at the same time the most likely and the most troublesome. This was contemporary Earth organisms, taken into space by inadequately sterilized spacecraft. Once in space, the organisms would be exposed to harsh radiation, weightlessness, and other environmental forces that might exert a mutagenic effect, altering the organisms. So that when they came down, they would be different. Take up a harmless bacteria, such as the organism that causes pimples or sore throats, and bring it back in a new form, virulent and unexpected. It might do anything. It might show a preference for the aqueous humor of the inner eye and invade the eyeball. It might thrive on the acid secretions of the stomach. This whole idea of mutated bacteria seemed far-fetched and unlikely to the wildfire people. It is ironic that this should be the case, particularly in view of what happened to the Andromeda strain. Stone reviewed the information quickly, then handed each of them a cardboard file. "These files," he said, "contain a transcript of auto-clock records of the entire flight of Scoop 7. The purpose in reviewing the transcript is to determine, if possible, what happened to the satellite while it was in orbit." Hall said, "Something happened to it?" Levitt explained. "The satellite was scheduled for a 6-day orbit. On the second day, it went out of orbit." They studied a transcript of moment-by-moment communications between Mission Control at Vandenberg and link-ups at Kennedy Space Center, Sydney, Australia, and Grand Bahama, all routed through Houston. The transcript included reports of a mysterious system malfunction and the decision of Mission Control to bring the satellite down. Several passages in the transcript had been deleted. Hall said, "What about the deleted passages?" "Major Manchek at Vandenberg told me," Stone said, "that they had to do with Russian craft in the area. The flight eventually concluded that the Russians had not either accidentally or purposely brought down the Scoop satellite. No one has since suggested differently." They nodded. "It's tempting," Stone said. "The Air Force maintains Watchdog facility in Kentucky that tracks all satellites in Earth orbit. It has a dual function, both to follow old satellites known to be in orbit and to track new ones. Now, the important thing is that, Russian or not, there are a hell of a lot of satellites up there. As of last Friday, the Air Force reported 587 orbiting bodies around the Earth. So a collision with a piece of junk is possible." "Yes, possible." "How about a meteor?" "That is
Go
the other
straight on.
possibility, and the one Vandenberg favors. A random event, most likely a meteor." Levitt cleared his throat. "There is still another possibility." Stone frowned. He knew that Levitt was imaginative and that this trait was both a strength and a defect. At times, Levitt could be startling and exciting. At others, merely irritating. It's rather far-fetched, Stone said, to postulate debris from extragalactic source other than... I agree, Levitt said. Hopelessly far-fetched. No evidence for it, whatever. But I don't think we can afford to ignore the possibility. A gong sounded softly.
Right.
A lush female voice, which Hall now recognized as that of Gladys Stevens of Omaha, said softly, "You may now proceed to the next level, gentlemen." Level 5 was painted a quiet shade of blue, and they all wore blue uniforms. Burton showed Hall around.
This floor, he said, is like all the others. It's circular, arranged in a series of concentric circles, actually. We're on the outer perimeter now. This is where we live and work. Cafeteria, sleeping rooms, everything is out here. Just inside is a ring of laboratories. And inside that, sealed off from us, is the central core. And that's where the satellite and the 2 people are now.
But they're sealed off from us?
Yes.
Then how do we get to them?
Have you ever used a glove box?
Burton asked. Hall shook his head. Burton explained that glove boxes were large, clear plastic boxes used to handle sterile materials. The boxes had holes cut in the sides and gloves attached with an airtight seal. To handle the contents, you slipped your hands into the gloves and reached into the box. But your fingers never touched the material, only the gloves.
We've gone one step further, Burton said. We have whole rooms that are nothing more than glorified glove boxes. Instead of a glove for your hand, there's a whole plastic suit for your entire body.
Keep left.
You'll see what I mean.
They walked down the curved corridor to a room marked Central Control. Levitt and Stone were there, working quietly. Central Control was a cramped room stuffed with electronic equipment. One wall was glass, allowing workers to look into the adjacent room. Through the glass, Hall saw mechanical hands moving the capsule to a table and setting it down. Hall, who had never seen a capsule before, watched with interest. It was smaller than he had imagined, no more than a yard long. One end was seared and blackened from the heat of re-entry. The mechanical hands, under Stone's direction, opened the little scoop-shaped trough in the side of the capsule to expose the interior. "Our next step," he said, "is to determine whether there is still anything in the capsule which is biologically active. Suggestions?"
A rat, Levitt said. Follow with a rhesus, Burton said.
Stone put his hands back on the controls, moving them gently. Through the glass, they saw the black metal fingers move to the far wall of the adjoining room, where several caged lab animals were kept, separated from the room by hinged, airtight doors. The wall reminded Hall oddly of an automat. The mechanical hands opened one door and removed a rat
Keep
in its
right,
cage,
and then
brought
exit
it into the
right.
room and set it down next to the capsule. The rat looked around the room, sniffed the air,
Exit
and
right.
made some stretching movements with its neck. A moment later, it flopped over onto its side, kicked once, and was still.
Get ready to
It happened
turn
with
right.
such astonishing speed, Hall could hardly believe it had happened at all.
My God, Stone said. What a time course.
Turn right.
Next, Stone directed the mechanical hands back to the wall, opening another door and withdrawing a cage containing a large brown adult rhesus monkey. A monkey screeched as it was lifted and banged against the bars of its cage. Then it died, after flinging one hand to its chest with a look of startled surprise. Stone shook his head. "Well, at least we know it's still biologically active. Whatever killed everyone in Piedmont is still there and still as potent as ever."
Go straight
Hall
on.
opened the door marked miscellaneous, thinking to himself that his job was indeed miscellaneous, keeping alive an old man and a tiny infant, both of them vital to the project and both of them, no doubt, difficult to manage. He found himself in another small room similar to the control room he had just left. This one also had a glass window looking inward toward a central room. In the room were 2 beds, and on the beds, Peter Jackson and the infant. But the incredible thing was the suits. Standing upright in the room were 4 clear plastic inflated suits in the shape of men. From each suit, a tunnel ran back to the wall. Obviously, one would have to crawl down the tunnel and then stand up inside the suit. Then one could work with the patients inside the room. The woman who was to be his assistant was working in the room, bent over the computer console. She introduced herself as Karen Anson and explained the working of the computer. "We're using the Medcom program. Do you know it?" Hall shook his head. "It's a medical data analyzer. You feed in information and it will diagnose the patients and tell you what to do for your therapy or to confirm the diagnosis." Hall looked through the glass at the two patients. "Well, what's been done on them so far?" "Nothing. At level 1, they were started on intravenous infusions, plasma for Peter Jackson, dextrose and water for the baby. They both seem well hydrated now and in no distress." She showed him how to crawl through the tunnel, and then, imitating her, he stood up inside the plastic suit. He felt like some kind of giant reptile, moving cumbersomely about, dragging his tunnel like a thick tail behind him. After a moment, there was a hiss. His suit was being sealed off. Then another hiss, and the air turned cold as the special line began to feed air to him. The technician gave him his examining instruments, while she drew blood from the child, taking it from a scalp vein. Hall turned his attention to Peter Jackson. An old man and pale, anemia, also thin. First thought, cancer. Second thought, tuberculosis, alcoholism, some other chronic process. And unconscious. He ran through the differential in his mind, from epilepsy to hypoglycemic shock to stroke. Hall later stated that he felt foolish when the computer provided him with a differential complete with probabilities of diagnosis. He was not at that time aware of the skill of the computer, of the quality of its program. He checked Jackson's blood pressure. It was low, 85/50. Pulse fast at 110. Temperature 97.8. Respirations 30 and deep.
Get ready to turn right.
He went over the body systematically, beginning with the head and working down. When he produced pain by pressing on the nerve through the supraorbital notch just below the eyebrow,
Turn right.
the man grimaced and moved his arms to push Hall away. Perhaps he was not unconscious after all. Perhaps just stuporous.
Keep left.
Hall shook him. "Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson." The man made no response. And then, slowly, he seemed to revive.
You have arrived at your
Hall
destination.
shouted his name in his
Your
ear and shook him
guidance
hard.
is now finished.
Peter Jackson opened his eyes for a moment and said, "Go away." Hall continued to shake him. But Jackson relaxed, going limp, his body slipping back to its unresponsive state. Hall gave up, returning to his physical examination. The lungs were clear, and the heart seemed normal. There was some tenseness of the abdomen, and Jackson retched once, bringing up some bloody, drooling material. Quickly, Hall did a bacillite test for blood. It was positive. He did a rectal exam and tested the stool. It was positive for blood. He turned to Anson, who had drawn all the bloods, and was feeding the tubes into the computer analysis apparatus in one corner. "We've got a GI bleeder here," he said. "How soon will the results be back?" She pointed to a TV screen mounted near the ceiling. "The lab reports are flashed back as soon as they come in. They are displayed there and on the console in the other room. The easy ones come back first. We should have the hematocrit in 2 minutes." Hall waited. The screen glowed, the letters printing out the results of the test. "Half normal," Hall said. He slapped an oxygen mask on Jackson's face, fixed the straps, and said, "We'll need at least 4 units of blood plus 2 of plasma. I'll order them." She went to phone the blood bank on level 2 and asked them to hurry on the requisition. Meantime, Hall turned his attention to the child. It had been a long time since he had examined an infant, and he had forgotten how difficult it could be. Every time he tried to look at the eyes, the child shut them tightly. Every time he looked down the throat, the child closed his mouth. Every time he tried to listen to the heart, the child shrieked, obscuring all heart sounds. Yet he persisted, remembering what Stone had said. These two people, dissimilar though they were, nonetheless represented the only survivors of Piedmont. Somehow, they had managed to beat the disease. That was a link between the two, between the shriveled old man vomiting blood and the pink young child, howling and screaming. At first glance, they were as different as possible. They were at opposite ends of the spectrum, sharing nothing in common, and yet there must be something in common. It took Hall half an hour to finish his examination of the child. At the end of that time, he was forced to conclude that the infant was, to his exam, perfectly normal, totally normal, nothing the least bit unusual about him, except that somehow he had survived. While Hall examined